Hej och välkommen till ännu ett avsnitt utav Mobilitetspodden från IUS Innovation. Podden som pratar om mobilitet högt och lågt och vill sprida kunskap om våran bransch och brygga gapet mellan allmänheten och oss nördar på insidan, hur det på att kalla oss. Hej Anna!
Det är ju, så det är helt okej. Hej!
Ja, och det är jag, Patrik, som vanligt står vid micken. Och
Anna Wadström heter jag.
Allt bra med dig?
Det är bra med mig,
Ja.
absolut.
Härligt. Återigen, bra väder när vi spelar in.
Vi måste kommentera vädret varje gång.
Det är fascinerande.
Ja.
Vi bor ju ändå i Göteborg där det regnar sidled och sällan sol så här års. Men nu är vi i poddstudion och då är det sol ute.
Som sig bör.
Ja. Men lite väder vi ska prata om. Vi ska prata mobilitet och vi ska faktiskt göra det med väldigt spännande gäster idag. Så vi ska faktiskt byta till lite mer internationellt språk.
Det ska vi göra.
Ja. So let me welcome Melissa and Chris Bruntlett coming in live from the Netherlands.
Hi there. Thanks for having us.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing well, yeah. It's a gray and drizzly morning here in Delft, but the bicycles are still floating by outside our window, so we're happy to chat to you today.
Nice. You have a great view then. See all the bicycles outside.
Yeah, we're quite fortunate through, luck, happenstance, who knows it. We happen to live at ground level on a canal and get to see the bikes go past every day, and the pedestrians actually. So our side is the walking side, and lots of people going by, peeking in, probably wondering what we're doing right now, but it's still nice.
Sounds very Dutch. I get a very Dutch picture in front of me. But obviously we need to point out that you're actually not from the Netherlands, but you're from almost the other side of the world. You're from Canada, right?
That's correct. Yeah, we moved here almost 4 years ago now from Vancouver, Canada. So the west coast of Canada to the north coast of the Netherlands, or of Europe. But yeah, it's kind of strange for us. We have to remind people when we show up to meetings that there's a reason that we don't sound Dutch when we're speaking English.
It's a bit a tricky language as well, isn't it?
Yeah, our kids seem to have mastered it, which makes us quite annoyed. But for Melissa and I, after 4 years, our conversational Dutch is okay, but we're still working on doing it in meetings and presentations, and at a more professional level, it is quite difficult.
I see. Yeah, so it was actually our colleague Jerome, and Jerome is sort of bicycle nerd,
yes.
And he had sort of got his side locked on you as inspiring people when it comes to bicycles, and that will be the theme for our episode today. But before we get into all this interesting stuff about the bicycling, I want you guys to introduce yourself a bit further. You're from Canada, obviously, but you must have an exciting story to tell, ending up in the Delft and working with what you do. So please introduce yourself.
Yeah, who wants to go first? It's a long story. How much time do we have? No, I'm kidding. We can shorten it.
Let's go for it.
Well, I think the thing we always stress is that we didn't come into this world with a transportation planning or engineering background. Melissa worked in the fashion industry, myself in architecture, working jobs in Vancouver. And through a kind of an experiment, we decided to sell our family car, having 2 small children, just out of the fact that we had so many options in our East Vancouver neighborhood. And that kind of set off a spark in the advocacy world, in the communications world. We got so many questions about how we make it work. The city of Vancouver itself was having a very existential conversation about bike lanes and the reallocation of road space that we kind of injected ourselves into. And it just snowballed into, a passion project on evenings and weekends, the founding of our own consultancy, Modacity, in 2014, the co-authoring of a book in 2018 that brought us to the Netherlands for a couple of research trips, and eventually landed us kind of our dream jobs working for Dutch organizations to export this model of Dutch cycling to cities around the world. So it's a very unlikely journey. It's certainly not one that we had in our minds when we graduated from university, but here we are, kind of having followed one opportunity to the next, pinching ourselves every day that we get to do this for a living and we get to live where we do live.
Yeah, and the story we kind of give is that we started out as accidental advocates in Vancouver because I was a mom moving around with. I mean, I'm a person, but I was at the time moving around a lot with 2 small children by bike. Lots of questions from the other parents at school. How do you make this work? You must be crazy. And so I started blogging at the same time. Chris started writing and working with the Cycle Chic group in Vancouver, and yeah, it all kind of started snowballing together. And it was a fortuitous trip to the Netherlands that made us fall in love with this place, both in terms of just the livability, but of course the cycling culture. And then having moved here, me working for Mobicon as a consultant in communications and engagement, and Chris for the Dutch Cycling Embassy as their communications manager, being surrounded by it and getting to actually feel the benefits of living in a really cycling friendly place. That's what led to writing the second book, which was sort of like a following of our journey, what that first year was like, but also talking about the really emotional and psychological and of course physical health benefits of living in a place that prioritizes people. So yeah, it's something that we get to enjoy every day. Of course, we sometimes take it for granted. We need that subtle reminder. But yeah, that's sort of where we find ourselves now, is in this happy space of being where we feel that we were always intended to be in the long run.
Wow,
Awesome.
that's an inspiring story indeed, and I'm sure we will get back to some parts of it during today's episode. What we usually do when we have guests, we start out by asking how they solve sort of their everyday mobility, from work to school, kindergartens, etc. And if there have been any recent changes, because what we see here in Sweden is a lot of changes is going on. People start to sort of abandon the private car, trying out sharing mobility or new types of solutions. So could you tell us a bit about your everyday mobility puzzle?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think mine's a little more simple than Chris's. We are at a point now where our kids are both in high school, so their mobility is entirely independent and has been now since almost when we moved here in 2019. So they get up, get to school by bike, do what they need to do in that respect. And for me, I work a sum total of 5 minutes by bike away from where we are, but somehow it seems more convenient than walking, so I tend to bike to and from work. And then otherwise, I take walking as a big part of how I move around now, because it is so comfortable, despite what people might communicate that walking in the Netherlands is not great. I spend more time walking in this city and in other cities than I do cycling. And I think it's what I think if we were to write another book, sometimes we joke we'd write a book about the walking city, because there's so much that we get to experience and see just by moving at that slow pace. So that's me.
Yeah.
Delft is like the model 15-minute city, right? It's like everything you need is within a short walk or cycle ride. And the ironic thing is, within a year of moving to Delft, the Dutch Cycling Embassy, my employer, was located here. We packed up and moved to Utrecht, which is nearly 70 kilometers east of Delft. And I think anywhere else in the world, Vancouver definitely, with such a significant move, I would have either had to change my job or change where we live. But in this case, because of the great train network, because of the bike train connection that exists here in the Netherlands, I can cycle to Delft Station, hop on a train within 3 or 4 minutes, and I'm in Utrecht in under an hour, being able to borrow a bike on the other end of my journey. So the bike train combination here that we constantly write and talk about on social media is a huge part of how we get around longer and longer distances all across the Netherlands. Including my daily commute to the office, which is more like 2 days per week. So I get to work from home here in Delft the other 2 days. So it's a nice mix of being here in Delft, but also doing kind of a a longer distance commute. But neither Melissa or I have driver's licenses, so we do all of our mobility without even borrowing a car, let alone owning a car.
That's quite impressive. I mean,
Yes.
if you have a stereotype, I mean, this goes perhaps more for a stereotypical American. But if you think about North America, you think about big F-150 trucks, and that
Yeah.
it's sort of an essential thing. You need to have like a driver's license and a big truck. But you managed anyway, which is really impressive.
It is.
And it's always interesting to hear about these mixed modality trips that people do, which I think is a sort of thing that's growing even more faster, since we have a lot of varieties these days that you can use a shared bike when you get to Utrecht. So it's interesting to hear that we can see that elsewhere as well.
Yeah,
so
definitely. Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about what you do. You each represent one. You do consulting both, or am I right?
Yeah, it's kind of it's always difficult to describe our jobs. For me, I started working at Mobicon right after we moved here as a communications person. So I was managing our communications channels in English and helping out with marketing in that respect. But in the last 2 years or so, that shifted more to working with communities on communications and engagement plans, doing workshops and capacity building. We developed a digital knowledge sharing program during the pandemic out of necessity called Mobicon Academy, where we bring in experts, or our own experts will share what they're working on. And so my job really focuses a lot around that in terms of working with organizations. Most recently, actually, which is quite exciting for me, I started working with Women Mobilize Women, which is an initiative through the TUMI Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative, funded by GIZ. It's like this long train of where that comes from. But my focus with them is really working on empowerment and enabling women's transport, largely in the global south, which is really exciting for me. But it's this nice variety of working with small communities in North America and Europe, and then also working with this larger NGO to really start shifting the conversation around mobility. And then you.
And then, Well, the Dutch Cycling Embassy is actually a not-for-profit. So we were funded by or initiated by the national government here in the Netherlands, the Ministry of Infrastructure, and we're more of a network organization. So we have now nearly 100 public and private Dutch organizations that we represent in terms of knowledge sharing, in terms of economic development. One of whom is Mobicon, so there is some alignment there in what we do. But basically, we act as this intermediary. Yeah, we get requests from all around the world, dozens and dozens per week, and we act as this resource to help them learn from the Netherlands in terms of translating and adapting these best practices, these principles. Cycle network design, cycle parking design, traffic calming and circulation, bike-friendly policy and budgeting, all these areas where the Netherlands has been developing and perfecting for many decades, where a lot of cities are just getting started and could use some support and expertise.
The nice thing is it gets you traveling around the world as well. So Chris is now, this autumn has been quite busy for you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we're working in every corner of the globe. I was just in Austin, Texas, of all places. But we're my director's currently in Egypt. We have a project coming up in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. We've had workshops in Estonia and Kosovo, and so far this year. So it's really diverse and exciting, and every day is a challenge.
Yeah, you're certainly global in your approach to mobility. That's really impressive. I wanted to follow up on one thing that you said was quite interesting, Melissa, because my background is also back at university. I did a lot of studying on the global south. So I was curious. You mentioned women's transport in the global south. Are there any differences to what types of challenges these women faces compared to let's compare with Europe then? What are the differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think surprisingly, there's a lot of overlap in terms of some of the challenges that we face. So there's just as the networks here have been designed for more economic trips, like getting to and from work, similar networks have been designed in Latin America, in Africa, in India, and the rest of Asia. And so that's, of course, the challenge is how do you enable women to transport in terms of doing care trips? So that's a big focus in terms of how to better facilitate that. But in some ways, in part due to lower economic means. I mean, women tend to work more part-time work or stay at home with kids. And so the economic means to drive around for a lot of populations, I think, is a larger challenge that they are focused on in those countries and on those continents. And so a lot of the projects that I've been able to be a part of look at, how do we make the experience of public transportation more cost effective for them? How do we address issues of sexual harassment or verbal harassment and those kinds of experiences? And a lot of it is really coming down to learning about the experience with the people that are from there. So we have a study coming out soon that was commissioned that specifically looks at African cities and what is that experience. And that study, which was focused on data collection, was actually done by sitting down with the women that are impacted and listening to them and gathering that qualitative data, which, I mean, that's something that we struggle with in Europe and North America as well, is how do you get those qualitative experiences translated into data to then come up with solutions. But yeah, I think, overall, I think we assume there are a lot of differences, but most of us are dealing with similar overarching challenges. And I think this speaks to even the work that we do in cycling as well, that we all have similar challenges, but it's the contextual differences and then figuring out how to address them that is the biggest sort of barrier and opportunity, I think.
Yeah, I mean, challenges like sexual harassment in public transportation, that's a reality in sort of Europe and the Western countries as well. So
exactly.
Definitely similarities, but also, I mean, to enable people to use a safe and accessible public transportation is perhaps something we take for granted here. While, I mean, access to public transportation, be able to get to work or to care, essentially whatever trip you're doing, the access to that is sort of an enabler for economic growth, and you sort of need to. Economic growth is essential for the global south to rise also. So I think it's a vital job to make sure that everyone can have access to safe public transportation.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and I find the work really exciting, and I'm enjoying learning about this new area of transportation as well.
So if we ask you, Chris, a little bit about, it seems like you're promoting a Dutch cycling model worldwide. Could you tell us a bit about this Dutch cycling model that seems to be quite popular?
Yeah, when you talk about the Netherlands as a cycling nation, and the numbers are quite staggering. There's more bicycles than people. There's more elderly people cycling than any other age group, more women cycling than men. You always get the same pushbacks. Yeah, but the Netherlands is a small country, but it's flat. But there's a temperate climate. You hear all these kind of excuses about why that wouldn't work elsewhere.
Yeah.
And the first thing we'll stress is, every city has its own geographic challenges, contextual challenges, cultural differences, but there's no reason you can't be inspired by the principles that have been developed here. We've talked about networks already a few times. The Dutch figured out in the 1970s that the best way to get more people cycling is to build a fine-grained grid of cycle routes, not just 2 or 3 cycle routes, but to look at the city as a collection of origins and destinations and try to give people the possibility to cycle from anywhere to everywhere. And it sounds like a no-brainer, but it's still something that a lot of cities aren't doing. They're not building these direct, cohesive, attractive cycle routes. So when you look at a city like Austin, Texas, where I just was a few weeks ago, they've taken these network design principles to plan a citywide cycling network. The plan there is to build out almost 700 kilometers of what they call Dutch-inspired cycle routes, to give everybody the possibility to cycle. And there's an understanding that even in a sprawling, hot Texas city, you're not going to get 40, 50, 60% of your population cycling. But what they've done that's quite intelligent is they've looked at the short car journeys that are taking place in their city. And even in a city like Austin, there are thousands and thousands of 1, 2, 3 kilometer car journeys in their city. And if you can build cycling infrastructure to give people an option for those short journeys, suddenly you have this huge boost in terms of traffic congestion, safety, air and noise pollution. And so to Austin's credit, they haven't said, oh, we're not the Netherlands. They've taken these ideas and translated them, and they've adapted them. They're connecting their cycling networks with their public transportation system, with their light rail system, just like the Dutch cities do. They're not using the excuses, and they're accomplishing a great deal. They've already built almost 400 kilometers of this 700 kilometer network, and they will be done in the next 5 years. And they're just, I think, this great model of when you put all the excuses aside and just set about applying best practice on your streets, you can really the sky's the limit in terms of building a much better city for people to live in, even if they don't ever get on a bicycle. And I think that's another important lesson here, that not everyone will cycle, but if you create a little bit of space for people who do so, then everyone will benefit.
Yeah, definitely. I have a question regarding the infrastructure. You talk about the network that you have in the Netherlands. What different layers are you talking about in the network in the Netherlands? We often hear about the fast routes and more local routes. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so most cities have essentially a 3-layer network in terms of their cycle network. And it's quite similar actually to like when you think of a road network. So you have your fast cycling routes, as you mentioned, or more of the, what is the actual term? Not distributor routes.
Yeah, they're slower.
Or faster routes. Yeah, and so those are the routes that are sort of on your major streets or near your highways that are getting people longer distances with fewer stops to make the trip as efficient as possible. And then you come down a level, and that's when you get your distributors. So that's your arterial roads, that's connecting people to, major destinations like shopping centers or, other more economically driven locations. So there'll be a few more stops along the way. Probably more intersections, so lots of protected intersections and roundabouts in those cases. And then you get down to the access road level, and that's your neighborhood street network. And so that's essentially, from home to school or getting to those distributor flow routes that are much more fine-grained and really connect people from where they live to where they need to go. And so those 3 layers working together give people options. And, this is when we come back to this idea of making sure that people can get from anywhere to anywhere. When we look at it from, the care trip perspective, for example, that's part of why women are able to cycle as much as they do and comfortably here, because basically every destination is connected in a really convenient way. And so not only does it make it better for women, or it makes it safer for children to get to school, which is why we have such high rates of children and teenagers cycling here, but it also makes it possible to share the load a lot better. Like Chris and I were very able to share the care work and the trips to school or the trips to, sports clubs and such, because it was easy for us to connect it with our other daily journeys a lot more efficiently.
And I think an important piece of this, and it's not, again, really, it's generally ignored or neglected by other cities, is the importance of traffic calming and traffic circulation in the planning of these networks. All of those local access streets are mixed traffic conditions. They're not separated cycle paths, but the car traffic has been really limited, filtered, reduced, and slowed to a speed of at least 30 kilometers an hour or slower. in combination with planning these routes, you have to make driving a little bit indirect, inconvenient, to nudge people away from the car, to make it more direct to walk or cycle in your city, but to also push the car traffic away from these access roads that people are walking and cycling on. Because if there are too many cars, the cars will dominate and people will feel unsafe or uncomfortable using those streets. And so there's a very careful planning of not just the bike network, but the car network, with the removal of conflict and overlapping. They're unraveled from each other so that they're not trying to use the same streets in the same space.
Yeah.
I can really feel myself that situation. I mean, we have some good bike lanes here in Gothenburg, but there are also central areas that are sort of not too good.
Yeah.
I mean, you feel extremely exposed to car traffic and like big buses and stuff, and you need to go through a crossing. It's quite uncomfortable to be honest. So
yeah, definitely.
But if you go ahead.
No, I was going to say, looking back into our experience in Vancouver, that the emphasis on the neighborhood streets was actually a lot of what would influence our route choices in Vancouver as well. I mean, they've got, over the last 20 years or so, they've been building out neighborhood bike networks, but also from 2008 starting to build out separated infrastructure to start to connect people a bit better. But there was still this traffic calming that Chris mentioned is so important, because there were a lot of routes that were considered bike routes or part of the bike network in Vancouver. But because of the number of conflicts that we would have had cycling with our kids or cycling on our own, with people in motor vehicles, people being quite aggressive, using the neighborhood streets as cut-throughs or rat running, as we refer to it in North America, that would make us not choose that route or choose to go by public transportation instead. And so these are like little details that we need to make more part of how we move around, so that we feel more comfortable. Like as Chris said, the people that want to get on a bike can have that choice and feel comfortable making it.
Mm.
Were you saying anything? Yeah, go ahead.
Both of us, yeah. No, I was going to ask, you talk about safety and also like giving cycles the space to travel on, but also making it less attractive to go by cars. Do you use a lot of signage, like on the roads and signs on the streets too? And how do they know if they're on a fast lane or a more local lane? Let's say that. So how do you communicate with the bicycles without like giving them a map?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think in general, the approach here is not to use signs. There's kind of an adage that if you need a sign, it's bad design, that you can intuitively and coherently design a system where the driver knows where he or she needs to be, and likewise the cyclist. And if you, again, remove those conflicts from the system, you push the car traffic onto the distributor roads, you see very little conflict. But the other, I think, dynamic that's happening here that a lot of other locations don't have the benefit of is that virtually everybody rides a bicycle. So even that person behind the wheel of a car probably rides a bike a couple times a week. It's in some cities, over 90% of the population cycles at least once a week. And when you have that built-in empathy and understanding, suddenly that person on a bike in front of you is a fellow human being and not just an obstacle or a barrier to where you need to get where you're going. But I think there's just a general acceptance and understanding that the city is where the cars are guests. Pedestrians and cyclists are the main users of those spaces. And you run into very few situations. I mean, in 4 years that we've lived here, I don't think we've ever been honked at or had an engine revved at us, which was a regular occurrence in Vancouver. Of course, it's partly through design, it's partly through culture, But when you build this city for people rather than motor vehicles, that sense of entitlement slowly erodes. But it does take time. The Dutch have been doing this for several decades, and now kind of reaping the benefits of that. Empathy and understanding.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that Chris is absolutely right. There's not a lot of signage here. I mean, I think we always get surprised when we see a stop sign because they're very irregular. But there are subtle cues, and like Chris said, with the design, when we're talking about pushing cars away from neighborhood streets, it's the traffic calming is things like speed tables that have you moving up and down when you're in a vehicle, or cobbled streets or chicanes that force people to move in a more serpentine way. And even the color, I think the Dutch are known quite famously for their red cycle tracks. And so that's how people, when you're on a bike, if you're on red, like on a red surface, 9 times out of 10, you're on some sort of cycle route, whether it's a cycle track or a neighborhood street or a fietsstraat or a bicycle street. And so those are the cues that that you're in the right space for you, and then also helps to indicate for other road users, like people in cars, that this space is not for you if it's like a bicycle street, for example, and so you have to behave accordingly.
Yeah, so very simply put, the Dutch emphasize engineering over enforcement and education. It's if there's bad behavior happening, if there's excessive speeding happening, it's seen as an engineering problem, and the street is often redesigned to get the behavior that you want to see, which is, again, unfortunately, the opposite of what a lot of cities do. They'll put a police officer on the corner,
sign up,
and just hope for the best. And there's an acceptance here that people are human. They break the laws accidentally and on purpose, and if the street is designed properly, those flaunting of the rules and laws and normal behaviors don't result in injury, death, or unsafe, uncomfortable situations.
Feel like that is a sort of a mindset that could be transposed on the electric scooters that's become super popular, but sort of the political debate in Sweden and elsewhere is sort of the e-scooters, they're bad.
Yeah.
But perhaps it's the cities there that's badly engineered. There's something to it. I wanted to go back a bit to attitudes and behavior, but before that, I just wanted to wrap up the story about infrastructure. Would you say infrastructure in thinking in terms of networks when you create cycle cities, is infrastructure the most important thing for succeeding?
Yeah, I think we get asked this question a lot, and I think it's hard when we're talking to other cities when we say infrastructure is the key, because it's a hard place to start from. It requires budget, it requires changing your planning documents and your policies. But at the end of the day, if you want to change cycling culture, if you want to change cycling behavior, and as a result also driver behavior, infrastructure is what has been, in our experience at least, the key component to changing how people feel moving through a city. And it doesn't have to be big and expensive. It doesn't have to be completely retrofitting your streets to look like a road dieted street here does. But infrastructure is part of that safety equation and that comfort equation for sure.
Infrastructure, is probably two-pronged, as we've kind of been saying. It's creating great spaces for people to cycle, but it's also restricting car use, and as Melissa's emphasized, it can be quite light, quick, and cheap. Just putting up planter boxes and barriers to filter traffic through local streets is a great start, because it's a really low cost and easy way to enable those short cycling trips within people's neighborhoods. And it's what you're seeing now in cities like Paris and Brussels and London. Is there's an understanding the separated cycle paths on the arterial roads will take time to design, build, and get the political will for. But in the meantime, there's lots of light, quick, cheap things we can do in our neighborhoods to enable those short trips to school and the corner store and to friends' houses.
And they can be measured and adapted and monitored. And so that's the nice thing about these pop-up infrastructures or tactical urbanism is it's an opportunity to test ideas and learn from them so that the solution that you have in the end is best suited for what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. But then let's focus a bit on mindset. The Dutch, they have a culture that goes back many decades. As long as I can remember, the people talk about the Dutch as a cycling people. Is there something unique to their mindset? Do people have other mindsets when you visit like Ho Chi Minh or Estonia or whatever? Is there something unique to their mindset that makes them successful in cycling?
I mean, I think so, but not because they're somehow better than the rest of us. I think, probably the experience of, people in Sweden, similar to people in North America and Canada, is that there was this period where the car grew in prominence, and so our streets were redesigned for them. And suddenly we lost this period, this basically a generational loss in terms of using cycling as a way to get around. And it became something for recreation, something that little kids do, something you do for fun along, and in a park or whatever. And it became less about, a cultural way of moving around at a slower pace. And because of the OPEC oil crisis here and the response from the Dutch, and because of the protest movements here, that
in the 1970s,
that generational loss didn't happen in the same way. So, I can say, yeah, my parents continued cycling because they lived in Montreal, and that was a city that stayed a cycling city and still is a cycling city in a Canadian context. But for Chris's family, on the other hand, that's something his parents didn't do. And so a lot of families have that, where just one generation before us, cycling became less part of their, for lack of a better way of saying it, DNA, whereas most people here, it's grandparents, great-grandparents, all through the generations, just from the moment the bike came over here from the UK in the late 1800s till today, somebody in their family has been cycling.
So when we're asked this question, we do say, there is something culturally different about the Dutch, but it was the political choices they made in the 1970s to stop building their cities around cars. That was the key decision, the pivot point, the cultural difference. Again, fueled by the oil crisis and the protest movements. They saw what was happening to their cities in terms of demolishing buildings, widening streets, creating parking lots, filling in canals, and they said, no, this is not what we want for our cities. To the point nowadays in 2022 where the vast majority of Dutch people and the people we speak to have no idea that this is something that's special or unique or to be cherished. They don't see the infrastructure that exists any more than they see their sewage pipes or their electricity grids. They just think of cycling as something quirky and cultural that they do. And when you talk about and point out the 37,000 kilometers of red asphalt that exists in this country, it's like a light bulb that goes off, because to them it's not occurred to them that their culture now in 2022 has been shaped by decades of building great infrastructure. So it's kind of a chicken and an egg. What comes first, the infrastructure or the culture? But one definitely influences the other in a very significant way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just want to circle back to what you said earlier regarding everyone is a cyclist in somehow. So therefore, when you see a bike, you don't see it as an obstacle. You see it as, that could have been me. And I think that's a nice way to see it. And I think, if more people would cycle, I think it will be like a build on each other. So more people cycle and they will have more security when they bike, and they get more understanding for the bicycles. I think,
It's really unfortunate, and it's just the psychology of being in a car wrapped in steel and glass, isolated from the city, isolated from the world, isolated from social contact. being able to travel fast speeds, only looking at the rear end of people in front of you, that you are become incredibly selfish and convinced of your own importance in the world and your own utility, and everything else becomes, as we said, an obstacle to get where you're going, and unfortunately that results in road rage and anger and frustration that manifests itself, and vulnerable road users are often bear the brunt of those frustrations. So there's a lot to be said just for slowing down the city. If you need car traffic at 30 kilometers an hour, you can still have those social interactions, the eye contact, and it reduces the rage and the frustration. It's when there's an expectation that cars can travel 50, 70, 80 kilometers within the city, that when they're not able to do that, it really results in these unsafe and uncomfortable situations.
Yeah.
But I mean, you do bring up a good point that, when more people cycle, more people have that empathy. And I think that's what we saw in Vancouver, from when we started in 2010, let's say, to be a little more on the advocate side of cycling, to when we moved in 2019, is we saw that shift, even with people that we knew that said, like, I don't know why you cycle, that's insane, it's dangerous, blah, 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 blah. And then you show them through pictures or you take them on a bike ride, and suddenly they see the city differently. And then you have, like, the number of times there were these light bulb moments, like, yeah, now I understand why I need to give more space to somebody when I'm driving, because it feels super uncomfortable when it's me and someone does the same. And there is really that value in learning. And I mean, we have the same aha moments with people that come here for study tours and experience the city differently. And they're like, oh yeah, now I understand what we're trying to achieve.
I was also a bit curious about sort of the public side, the role of the public authorities in terms of cycling, because as we can tell from the Dutch example, is that the oil crisis had set some preconditions that the policies had to adapt to, and how proactive does a government or public authorities need to be in to create a beneficial cycling and culture?
I mean, I think what we have experienced living in North America and traveling around the world is the role of political will in making those changes. You can have the most progressive municipal staff, designers, planners that want to build for cycling, but if that push isn't coming from your politicians, it's really hard to get there. And it's something that, we have friends in various communities and jurisdictions that work at city levels, and the frustration often that they'll express, that they know what they need to do, but the mandate's not there to get them to do that. They're still working against a bit of a wall. That is an indication for us anyways, that having a strong mayor or a strong council that is saying we are committing to Vision Zero, or we are committing to increasing cycling, and this is how we're going to tangibly do it. Those cities see a greater success when they have that political will and leadership.
The will becomes all the more important once you propose the removal of car lanes, car parking, the inconvenience of cars. Controversy inevitably erupts. There's angry voices, there'll be negative newspaper coverage, and so on and so forth. But it has to be put into context, and unfortunately, I think we see that as being representative of the larger city, that just a few small angry people can make something seem unpopular, when in fact, and we see this time and time again with the re-election of these mayors that put themselves out there initially, is that there are huge segments of the population, 60 to 70%, that are in favor of change to their streets. They want their children to be able to walk and cycle safely. They want choices in their mobility network. They're just not out there writing letters to the editor or lobbying their politicians on social media. They are this quiet majority that exists, and I think the politicians that have been really successful have recognized that ignored the controversy, with the understanding that it comes with the territory, and it is just a vocal minority, and that's really the role that the local government can play to get this done, because you're not going to make everybody happy. It's impossible, and when you try to do that, you make nobody happy.
Yeah.
But you really have to kind of understand that this is there's huge numbers in your city that want to cycle more, that want to walk safely, and we should be catering to them and not the loud, angry folks on social media.
Yeah. So it's a lot about bravery from individual politicians to I need to pick that fight with those people who drive cars. Perhaps I need to antagonize them, even though they're vocal, because that's actually, as you said, silent minority here. It's that bravery that's important. Yeah.
But you can understand, right? Like Elke van der Brand is the mobility minister in Brussels. She just implemented a 30-kilometer-hour speed limit and a traffic circulation plan earlier this year. She's receiving death threats and has to walk around with security guards. It's crazy. It's really unacceptable. But that's how irrational this conversation gets, and how angry people get when you talk about inconveniencing a mode of transportation that has been prioritized for decades and decades in our city. There's this sense of entitlement that cars should be able to go everywhere as fast as they want. And rant.
Yeah.
And rant.
I feel like that's very much what we see here in Gothenburg. Like, we have the very inner circle. You have almost like a highway going through Gothenburg, which is crazy. Like, you don't understand until you really look at it how much privilege the car has in our city. And I also feel like they want to do, like the politicians, they want to do something about it, but they say we want to increase bicycling, but at the same time we need to have motorized vehicles having very good access to the city. Like, those are very contradictory, and I don't think that can work. Like, we can't have both. We can have access, but I think, as you both mentioned, we need to do some limiting. Like, we need to make those very brave choices to really make a change and get more cyclists in the city.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's often lost in this conversation, with focusing on the controversy, there's two things. The first is that oftentimes when these traffic circulation plans or reduced speed limits go into place, and that political bravery is there, what we often find in most cases is that everything works out okay. There's a lot of controversy in the beginning, a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of people are like, oh no, it's going to be the end of the city. And then, 2 months later, people can't even remember what it was like before, and they don't want it to go back to what it was before. But the other part that I think people forget when we're talking about transportation, we're often, I think inherently our bias goes to, we're talking about people between the ages of 18 and 60 who are working, who are relatively fit enough to get around in a bunch of different ways, and, able to navigate the streets quite safely and comfortably. But we forget about children who can't drive, and so they're either reliant on an adult to get them around, or we say, okay, you should walk and cycle, but we're not going to do anything for you because that might inconvenience drivers, which is a crazy thing to say. And then the flip side, we all get old and we all can't drive safely at some point. So to say that we're going to prioritize and make things more comfortable for people in a car, we're forgetting about our grandparents. We're forgetting about our neighbors who have limited mobility, even if they're not seniors. If there's someone with a physical disability who is unable to drive, we're basically telling them, you don't have the same rights to the city. And I think that's what Chris and I try to emphasize where we can, is that importance of recognizing the role of the transport network in making it possible for kids, for elderly, for people with limited mobility, people with limited access to cars, because not everyone can afford a car, giving them the same rights to the city that those of us that have that privilege because of age or income get to enjoy every day.
And rant.
And rants.
Great. It seems like you have so much knowledge about cycling, and it's really inspiring to talk to you. I think time is sort of running out, and I hope that this gets a lot of attention in our social media channels. But if people can't get enough of you written books about this topic as well, could you just pitch your books? I give you the space to pitch your books here, because I have one of them here in front of me. So it's
same you have at a picture behind you.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah.
So that's our second book, Curbing Traffic, the human case for fewer cars in our lives. And I think we often joke that one should have been the one we wrote first, but we wouldn't have been able to write it without moving to the Netherlands and having the experiences that we did. So that's why it came second. And that's the one that I said focuses a lot on how our built environment affects us at not just a physical level, but also in terms of our mental health and our social connection to our city. So that's book number 2.
Well, and just going off of that, the impetus, because we had no intention of writing a second book, the experience of moving to the Netherlands, because we've talked so much about cycling, our light bulb moment when we landed here and started living as residents was that it's not about cycling. It's not about getting more people on bikes as the end goal. That Dutch cities use cycling as a policy tool to accomplish much bigger things like inclusion, like equity, like mental health, and sustainability, affordability, so on and so forth, access to opportunity. That the bicycle is just this means and not an end. So that's the general theme of Curbing Traffic. Having said all that, our first book is Building the Cycling City, which was written when we came to the Netherlands for 5 weeks. We're completely inspired by the cycling infrastructure, and we just wanted to explain how it happened historically, how it happened in terms of policy making, and what other cities around the world are applying these principles on their own streets. So Building the Cycling City is the how, Curbing Traffic is the why.
Yeah.
And we're not sure if there'll be a third book. There's no plans for now. We're too busy with our day jobs to even consider that as a possibility.
Yeah, but because it's not that often that we're able to give out book tips about mobility in this podcast. So it's really great that we're able to do that. So people, please check it out.
Yeah.
By all means.
Definitely. Oh, what an interesting conversation. I feel like we could go on forever.
It was really interesting to have you here, and a huge thank you for taking your time on your Friday off. So
our pleasure.
So
thank you so much for listening, and talk to you again soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.